In our last lecture, we examined the figure of Pyrrhus. He was a man of tremendous ability who was ranked by Hannibal, no mean authority, as the greatest general in history next to Alexander himself. He was a man who had opportunity and lost it. In our last lecture, we want to examine the figure of Cleopatra. This was a woman who created her opportunities and came close to overthrowing the might of Rome. She is truly one of our famous Greeks and worthy to end our study of the great lives of Greeks and their meaning for us. As Pyrrhus was sailing away from Sicily in one of his many futile expeditions, he exclaimed, "What a splendid cockpit we are leaving for Carthaginians and Romans to fight in." And indeed, the defeat of Pyrrhus by the Romans in 275 simply opened the way for their final conquest of Italy, and within 6 years, the beginning of their great war with Carthage. And by 201 BC, the Romans had vanquished Carthage in 2 wars, including the mighty general Hannibal. And by the year 146 BC, the Romans were not only masters of the Western Mediterranean, they were masters of the entire Mediterranean world. For no sooner had they defeated Hannibal than they turned upon the monarchies of the Greek East, and step by step, with military power and superb diplomatic skills, they divided and they conquered, breaking the power first of Macedonia, then the kingdom of the Seleucids, until by 146, in a display of hubris, the Romans burned to the ground the cities of Carthage and Corinth as a symbol of their unshakable power to do anything that they wished. The wisest of all the Hellenistic monarchs, the monarchs of the Greek East, were the kings of Egypt, Ptolemy and his descendants. For they very early on realized the power of Rome and sought to accommodate themselves to it. And although under Roman domination, the Ptolemies, ensure their nominal independence until the very end, until the time of Cleopatra. The Ptolemies governed an extremely well-administered empire. In the first place, Egypt had been a single country since 3000 BC. Organized under its pharaohs, it was easy for the Ptolemies to step in, establish their own Greco-Macedonian bureaucracy, and they were wealthy and made the decision not to engage in fruitless wars, unlike Pyrrhus. And although rather ineffectual personally, the Ptolemies managed to maintain their independence, carefully negotiating the shoals of war, as Roman general after Roman general sought for absolute dominion over the Republic, negotiating between Sulla and Marius, negotiating between even Pompey and Caesar. And the last of the male dynasty of the Ptolemaic kingdom were the father and the brother of Cleopatra. Her father was called the flute player, or the symbolic of the lack of respect paid to these Ptolemaic kings. And upon his death, at the age of 18, Cleopatra became queen, sharing the throne with her brother, constantly struggling with her brother, trying to negotiate around him, until he made the fatal mistake of opposing Julius Caesar. And in 47 BC was killed, and Caesar was at a loss as to what to do with Egypt. His first thought was simply to annex it. This had long been a Roman intention. But as he was pondering this in Alexandria, he had defeated Ptolemy. He was now really master of the Roman world. As he was there in Alexandria pondering this question, a beautiful rug was brought to him. And he said, "I don't need a rug right now." And the rug merchant said, "Oh, I think you will like this," and unrolled it. And there was the gorgeous Cleopatra, ready for Caesar. And Caesar was never one to miss an opportunity. She became his mistress. He took her back to Rome, and she lived there as his mistress, as well as being queen over Egypt, because he put her in that place, from 46 until his assassination in 44 BC. she bore him a son, Caesarion, little Caesar, and after his assassination went back to Egypt. Now, in the turmoil following the assassination, the Roman world was at first divided between Mark Antony and the adopted son of Caesar, Gaius Octavius, who after his adoption by Caesar, he was posthumously adopted, became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. His contemporaries generally called him Caesar, but to keep things straight, we call him Octavian. And his first task, along with Mark Antony, the close friend of Julius Caesar, was to take vengeance upon Brutus and Cassius for their treacherous murder of great Caesar. And this was accomplished in the year 42 BC at the Battle of Philippi. And after that, still nominally friends, still participating in the triumvirate, a legal institution established by the Roman Senate of the three men, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, still part of this triumvirate, Antony and Octavian effectively divided the Roman world between themselves. Lepidus was soon disposed of to live out his life as a private citizen. And by 41 BC, Octavian was busy in the West, in Italy, Gaul, Spain, North Africa, settling all the issues that had been raised by civil war, trying to bring back political order and economic prosperity. And Antony had the wealthy provinces of the East, such as Syria, with supervision over Egypt, and the very difficult task of dealing with the Persian Empire, the Parthians. And there he was in 41 BC in the beautiful city of Tarsus, and he had sent out summons to all the client kings, all those kings and queens who were dependent upon Roman power. And one by one they came to the city of Tarsus, prostrating themselves before great Antony, begging their kingdoms from him. And one who had still not come was Cleopatra. He summoned her again, and finally she arrived. And the messenger said, "Cleopatra, queen of Egypt, is here, but she would like you, triumvir, Mark Antony, to come to the dock and see her." Now, Antony was a bold soldier. He was an extraordinarily clever man who had played his cards with remarkable sharpness in the days after the assassination of Julius Caesar. A trained soldier, a very good judge of character. But he also had a boisterous side to him, and he said, "Well, what impudence from her. I think I'll go down and see her. After all, I knew her when she was Caesar's mistress." And he went down, and there she was on the royal barge. It had a sail down, like a great cover. And it was pulled up to reveal her, Cleopatra, lying there on like a giant clamshell, like Venus, in the most sheer of nightgowns. And Antony leapt on board. They had this magnificent banquet at which she let down these huge chandeliers, candles in all shapes and formations, stars and half circles and full circles and squares, a light show of the kind Antony had never seen before. And she now captivated him. And in fact, within a year, had borne him children, twins. And she was beautiful. Now, sometimes you will see these very badly done coins struck by her, bronze coins, that are just not well struck, and they show her with a hook nose and everything like this. Believe me, she was gorgeous. And Plutarch says that at every stage of her life, she was beautiful. But she had come into the fullness of her beauty when she first became the mistress of Mark Antony. And she wasn't just beautiful to look at. She was beautiful to be with. Languages. Most of the kings and queens of Macedonia could barely speak Greek. She spoke Greek, the ancient Macedonian language. She spoke Egyptian. She spoke Arabic. She spoke Syriac. She spoke Ethiopian, Berber. She was a master of languages. Philosophy. She could talk about philosophy, Plato. Or what Antony liked to talk about was sports. And she could talk about sports. And she went with every side of Antony's character. Like they used to get dressed up and go around the streets, first of Tarsus and then of Alexandria, dressed in rags, beating on people's windows, and the people would run out and try to chase them away, and suddenly they would reveal who they were. Or she would go fishing with Anthony, and she knew how he liked to show off in front of her to prove how really successful he was in every enterprise. And so one day he kept catching these huge fishes all day long, and she found out from one of the servants that what he was doing was having slaves swim under the water and put these giant fish on his hook. And so the next day they went out fishing again, and she had someone swim down and put a little sardine, preserved fish on his hook, and he pulled it out and he said, "I'm so embarrassed." She said, "Don't be, for you are to be master over the world. Leave fishing to others." And so she could captivate him in every way. And she constantly bolstered and supported him in his ever-growing difficulties with Octavian. For it was clear that absolute power could not be divided, and sooner or later these two would come to war for the sake of empire. And Antony was increasingly in the grasp of a woman of bold vision. She may have loved Anthony. He certainly loved her. But her goal was to use Anthony to overthrow the power of Rome, certainly in the eastern Mediterranean. She believed an empire could be established, and there were precedents for it, based upon Greek culture, dominating Egypt, Syria, perhaps as far as Macedonia, and that she would be the ruler of this empire, and that Rome could be driven away from the Greek portions of the world. It was a vision that would ultimately be realized in Constantinople, which would last so long after Rome in the West had fallen. In the year 476, Constantinople would last right down to 1453, based upon Greek civilization, the Greek language and culture. And this was a vision of Cleopatra. And there were omens and oracles that foretold it. Now, to do this, she had to have the absolute devotion of Anthony. She could brook no rivals. He had been married, and was still married, to Octavia, the sister of Octavian. She was herself beautiful, utterly loyal to Anthony, and constantly intervened on his behalf, put aside the stories about Cleopatra, and constantly sought to get her brother to get along with Anthony. And yet, Mark Antony lived openly with Cleopatra. And then he led an expedition against the Parthians, a very dangerous foe, which in the year 53 BC had utterly destroyed a Roman army under the general Marcus Crassus. And Antony was so distracted by his devotion to Cleopatra that he led the expedition out too early, refused to take proper precautions, refused to develop the necessary siege weapons, and when he returned, he had left behind 20,000 Roman soldiers dead in a disastrous expedition. He was a capable general, regarded as the most capable general of his day. And the only explanation that could be put forward is that he was being driven mad by Cleopatra. And Octavian formally brought this before the Roman Senate, that this Egyptian witch had given magical drinks to Anthony that were destroying his mind. It certainly looked that way, for when his dutiful wife Octavia came with reinforcements, money, food, and clothes for his troops, he sent her away and wouldn't even receive the reinforcements and food and clothes that she was bringing while taking them from Cleopatra. And then in 34 BC, he formally bestowed upon her children by him portions of the Roman Empire, giving away the legacy of the Roman people, and as well recognizing as the legitimate son of Julius Caesar, Caesarion, her child by the great conqueror Caesar. And now, moving rapidly, Octavian used every medium of propaganda to spread throughout the western part of the empire. The danger represented by Cleopatra, the utter madness of Antony, and the necessity to declare war, not upon Antony, for that would be civil war, but upon Egypt and Cleopatra. And so that war was declared. In the midst of all of this, Cleopatra and Antony continued with their lavish lifestyle. They had a group of cronies around them. They called them the Society of Crazy Livers. And every night they would have a huge banquet. And Plutarch would tell that his grandfather himself had heard the story from an eyewitness, a young man who had been studying medicine in Alexandria, and went one evening to the palace where he knew the cook, and went into the kitchen, and there were 8 boars roasting. And the young medical student said, "How many people are coming to this banquet tonight?" And the cook said, "Oh, there are only 12. 8 roast boars for 12 people? Ah, you don't understand how it is here. Antony wants his food served just right. And we never know when he's going to eat. He might sit down at the table immediately. That's this boar down here. But he might say, oh, let's have a drink. So that's this boar here. And he might just get to talking, and Cleopatra just leads him on, you know, so that everything he says is so witty and charming. So by the time he's really drunk and talking, that's this last boar down here. It'll be ready. So that is how we have to cook here. So this society of the crazy livers, and all the time Octavian was drawing more and more support until Tota Italia, all of Italy, rose up. Now Antony still had loyal supporters in the Senate, and they went to him at the court of Cleopatra to urge upon him the importance and danger of this situation. And Cleopatra again could brook no rivals, and so they were put down at the far end of the banquet table, you know, table number 47 out of 47, so way back in the back. And whenever they tried to talk, she would interrupt them and say, you know, they are just trying to destroy your confidence. Don't listen to them. And one by one, they went back to Italy and told the Senate the situation is more serious than you can even imagine. How Mark Antony, from having been such a superb soldier and capable statesman, one of the most trusted friends of Julius Caesar, has sunk into this apathetic and lethargic creature of this Egyptian. But you know, don't you think it's worthy to give up everything for love? I ask my classes this, and not one of them will raise their hand and say that you should give up everything for love. But I think it's a noble thing, and Antony is one of these men who was willing to put aside everything for love, totally captivated, could not eat or drink without Cleopatra there. She dictated all of his thoughts. And so war was declared, and the armada of mighty Octavian sailed. Now, Mark Antony still had at his disposal probably 100,000 crack infantry. He had a large ship of some 500 warships, a large fleet of some 500 warships. Octavian probably had 80,000 men and a fleet of 250. So both by land and by sea, Antony and Cleopatra had superior forces. And the army of Antony was loyal to him. And he, with Cleopatra, sailed to Greece, determined to meet Octavian at the closest possible point in the northwestern part of Greece, near the little city of Actium, near Promontory. When the fleet of Antony arrived and his troops were all mustered, he addressed his infantry and said, I have decided that we must first test the foe by sea. And his troops, his infantry, their faces fell. What have we done to you, Imperator? For that was the name by which they hailed him for his past victories. What have we done to you that you don't trust us, that you trust to ships sailed by foreigners instead of your own soldiers? And he went back to Cleopatra and said, I think we should make a test of Octavian by land. After all, in every battle he's fought, I was the one who really won it. He's not a good general, and my men are loyal and ready to fight for us. And she said, "Oh dear, it's so dusty by land. Let us trust to our ships, to my brave Egyptian sailors." He said, "Oh, all right, whatever you say, darling." And so he agreed to it. And on September the 2nd, 31 BC, the two fleets were drawn up. Antony's fleets consisted of some ships that had 8 to 10 banks of oars. Remember our triremes with 3 banks of oars? These are 8 to 10, sitting up high in the water, heavy. Octavian had extraordinarily well-designed ships, fast in the water. They could dart in and out and surround Antony's ships. And as he was going out to board the admiral's ship that morning, Octavian met a peasant going along with his little donkey. And he said, "Hello there, old fellow. What's your name?" And the peasant said, "They call me Lucky." "They do," said Octavian, who was a great believer in omens. "And what do they call your donkey?" "Why, I call him Little Victory." And so Octavian, full of confidence, went into his admiral's ship. But the beginning of the battle seemed to disclaim this. For all along the way, Antony's ships were winning. Octavian boarded the ships of Antony with his soldiers. The fighting went back and forth. But Antony was about to win the day, when suddenly, from his own admiral's ship, Antony spied Cleopatra turning her ship and being rowed out of the battle, deserting him. And instead of staying and fighting with his soldiers, he turned out of the line of battle and went after her. His soldiers and sailors could not believe it. But he deserted them, sailed up, caught up with the ship of Cleopatra, and climbed on board. She started to say something to him. He said, "I'm mad at you. I'm not speaking." And he went up and sat at the prow of the ship. And they sailed back to Egypt. So little wonder that his fleet went over to Octavian, and all those 100,000 brave soldiers surrendered and were treated with honor by Octavian. And now, step by step, Octavian came ever closer to Alexandria. They still had one more winter together, because Octavian was very methodical in reducing each area of resistance to him. And they now dissolved their society, Antony and Cleopatra did, their society of the crazy livers, and had a club called the Crazy Dyers. And every night they had their big banquets. Until finally, the fleet and infantry of Octavian arrived. Antony wrote out a bold note saying, "I want you to come out and fight me man to man, sword to sword." Octavian didn't even respond. That was nonsense. Why should he go out and fight Antony? In fact, Octavian always managed to stay out of battles as much as he could and let other people command. And so he rowed his fleet into the harbor, and the fleet of Antony, such as it was, rolled out. And Antony said, "Attack them, men!" And instead, they raised their oars and shouted out to Octavian, "Hail, master of the world!" and went over. The cavalry of Antony went out, and as soon as they saw Octavian, raised their swords, "Hail, master of the world!" and went over to Octavian. And so too his infantry passed over. Now, as Octavian was entering the city of Alexandria, Antony was in his own little castle. Cleopatra was in her own castle. And Cleopatra said, "You know, Antony has been treating me so shabbily these last few days. He blames me for all of this. Why, I'm going to show him." And so she sent a messenger off saying, "The queen has killed herself." Antony read the message. "I can't stand it," and stabbed himself. The messenger said, "But no, Imperator, she's not really dead. She just wanted to make you, worry about her a little bit. You've stabbed yourself." Antony said, "I know, I'm dying, but take me to her." And so he is carried across town. And Cleopatra doesn't want to come out of this tower she has built for herself, this fortification. So instead she lets down this basket. And Antony is put in this basket. And Cleopatra with her maids bring him up like this. Pull him up, on a rope into her apartment. And there the great figure of Antony dies, wrapped in the arms of Cleopatra. You don't think that is pathetic? But he's gone, too bad. But Octavian is here. And after all, she has mastered Julius Caesar. She has mastered Antony. She can sure master Octavian. And so she sends word that she wishes to see him, and he sends word, I am happy to see you, and he goes inside where a little tower there that he is now surrounded with troops, and she is there. Now she is in a very sheer nightgown. She has put just the right amount of makeup under her eyes to make it look as though she's been crying in an appropriate fashion for Antony. But she has all these little presents for the wife of Octavian, and he is happy because he knows she has made up her mind to live now. And she sits there in a very alluring fashion, lying there on the couch, and he talks with her a bit, and then he looks at her with absolute coldness in his eyes and said, now, you go back with me to Rome. You will be led in my triumph. How could you have destroyed a good man like Antony? What could my father Caesar ever have seen in you? She's after all 39 now, getting along. And so he leaves and gives absolute word to his soldiers not to let her kill herself. But she will not be led back in triumph. And one day there shows up at her little castle where she's under armed guard a peasant, seemingly a peasant, with a big basket full of figs. And the soldiers look at these and say, they're magnificent figs. And they say, we brought them for the queen. They take them up. See, she reaches in, and hidden in there by previous plan is an asp, a viper. And she puts it to her arm and dies. So passes the last of our famous Greeks. We ask ourselves the question, do we learn from these biographies? Well, the founders of our country believed that Plutarch was the most useful reading you could do. And one of them argued that a set of Plutarch ought to be purchased and placed into every library in this country. I think it's still a good idea. On the personal level, ask ourselves, we have learned about ambition. That has been the leitmotif, ambition. From an Alexander the Great to the ambition of a Cleopatra. From Theseus right through the figure of Pyrrhus. Learned about ambition. But on the personal level, you might ask yourself, what is the focus of my ambition? What's the object? And we learned from Pyrrhus how unless you have a focus, you fail. And the focus of most of these figures has been power. But ask yourself the question, as Plutarch does, are you up to that power? You can be an Alexander and achieve the heights of greatness. Or you can be a Nicias, searching for an office that you fail miserably in and bring destruction upon your fellow citizens. So are you up to your ambition? And then, how are you going to get there? For we've had models of honesty and integrity. We've had statesmen like a Pericles with his bedrock of principle. We've had the honor of an Achilles. And we've had examples of lies and duplicity. Remember Odysseus? He survives because he knows how to tell many lies and to tell them well. And perhaps the best advice you'll get is from old Solon. Nothing in excess. He was given great power, but did not abuse it. He enjoyed his wealth, but none of our figures sought to just make money. They all wanted to go beyond that to achieve greatness. And you see, this is a story not just about individuals, but about nations. Nations as well as individuals commit hubris, that outrageous arrogance. And given great power, we can be an Alcibiades or a Xerxes and end as miserable failures, as Persia did. Or we can be an Alexander and leave a legacy that still resonates today. And the two greatest stories in our biographies have been one, the figure of Alexander, who reached for the heights. And the other, the Athenians themselves, as embodied in their very best leaders, like Pericles, or their figures like Sophocles and Socrates. They too reached for the heights and left behind the most enduring legacy in their art, in their literature, in their thought. So I say reach for the heights. Be sure you're capable and then reach for the heights and leave behind that legacy for good. That's the ultimate value to studying the lives of the famous Greeks.